I've got an update for you guys. A pretty massive update. An update that's really gonna shake this war to its core. Yevgeny Prigozhin started as a street thug, thrown into prison for just common street crime, you know, muggings and stuff like that. Then he became a restaurant owner once he got out of the criminal justice system, moving his way up to eventually be a hot dog vendor. Many people say what that really means is money laundering, but putting that aside, through maneuvering in Moscow politics, he was able to get into Putin's inner circle, then become leader of the Wagner group, and the rest is history. Not only when it comes to the Wagner group's activities in Central Africa, in Sudan with the RSF, in Syria, and conquering oil fields and getting very large percentages of oil field revenue, getting the rights to gold mines in Africa, the beating to death of people with sledgehammers. But of course, what most people will know them for and what they're most notorious for, their horrific war crimes in Ukraine as they recruited prisoner soldiers that was known to engage in extrajudicial killings, torture, and the execution of their own recruits with sledgehammers if they didn't properly follow orders. So he has a pretty bad reputation, Mr. Wagner, Mr. Yevgeny Prigozhin, and this is just talking about Wagner. This isn't even talking about his time with the troll farms. Well, that man, who has been a staple of this war, who shoved himself into the world headlines through his mutiny 2 months ago, which made many people think that Russia itself was on the brink of collapse, and he showed the weakness of the system. Many of us were surprised that he survived that. Despite how crafty he was, all of us knew that him surviving his direct challenge to Putin when Putin told him as he marched on Moscow that you will be punished for your crimes. You will be punished for turning against me. They then proceeded to kill 20 Russian airmen. We didn't think that that could be let go, that they had to crack down on it or Putin would look weak. But they were let go. They were allowed to flee to Belarus and presumably up to this point allowed to continue their activities in Africa, which were quite profitable, at least for them, if not for Russia, even if it helps their national security interests. But all things come back to bite you in the end. You know, justice survives in some ways, even if it doesn't survive in other ways. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, along with many other top Wagner leaders, were killed in a plane crash I believe northwest to Moscow. Now, I have some footage of this plane crash that I'm going to play for you all. I believe Anamarchy, this is a version he edited, so have fun with it. This is the original version, unedited, but he just, you know, polished it a little bit to give it a tiny bit of flair. Here's the footage of the plane sinking. I mean, not sinking, but crashing into the ground. Then we're going to talk about it. Yeah, so as you can see, you know, very, very interesting clip. Now, besides the audio, that is the real footage of the plane crashing into the ground. Now, there are some people who are still speculating, since we have yet to recover the body, even though we do have footage of the crash site, and it's pretty clear that, that plane they were riding in is not in great shape, and there has been some screenshots of what appears to be bodies. We don't have any photographs of Prigozhin's body. Local Russian state media say that the bodies are so damaged and so charred that they're impossible to identify, but that they were identified through DNA testing to be Yevgeny Prigozhin, Dmitry Utkin, which is his second in command. He's well known for managing more of the military affairs of Wagner. He's also well known for being a neo-Nazi. He has SS tattoos on his chest and neo-Nazi swastikas and the German eagle. A lot of the top Wagner leadership were killed, and that's what Russian state media is saying. Even though, again, I do need to emphasize, much of the information we're getting is from Russian state media, Russian telegrams, Wagner accounts, but everything seems to be pointing in one direction, and it makes sense with Putin's motives. And that's why I want to say it's so easy for me to believe this. Not only is it easy for me to believe this because every single source is saying, yeah, this looks real. Not only is it easy to believe me because this is Yevgeny Prigozhin's plane, but it's the easiest for me to believe this because this lines up with Putin's interests. Vladimir Putin's regime was shown as weak when Yevgeny Prigozhin marched on the capital with his Wagnerite mercenaries. He marched on the capital, directly rejected Putin's rule, tried to hold hostage Shoigu and Gerasimov, failed, but then marched on the capital, killing 20 Russian airmen, challenged his system. Putin told him to stop, he didn't, and he survived to live another day. Even though they killed 20 Russian airmen, there were no repercussions. How did that make Putin look? Even if you don't think that spelled the end of his regime, and I think that is jumping the gun, at the very least, even if you don't believe that this is a sign to things to come, even the most pro-Putin people in the regime were thinking of contingency plans. Even if you weren't yourselves planning Putin's downfall or seeing who you can, work with in this faction or that faction to intensify your benefits in the Russian infighting for when Putin eventually croaks. Even if you weren't doing that, you certainly were planning for something like what happened with Prigozhin happened again. And maybe next time it won't be Prigozhin. Maybe next time it would be General Armageddon, Surovikin, hero of Russia. Of course, with his reported detainment and the hot water he's in right now because of allegations that he might have been within Wagner's inner circle, a VIP member of Wagner, possibly involved in the mutiny attempt, puts a wrench in him being the person. But you get the idea. People are planning. It showed Putin to be weak. And I think it most likely encouraged Western leaders to think that their pressure campaign on Russia was working, and this was its system cracking and crumbling at the seams. At the seams, that is. So I think that Putin doing this makes complete sense. It falls within his interests. I do want to say, though, that even if it falls within his interests, and even if it does somewhat make his regime look a little bit stronger since he could get away with this, that doesn't mean that, is back in the can, that all of the stuff that Prigozhin exposed is now recovered up. That isn't the case. That isn't the case at all. Prigozhin still proved that Russia didn't have a strong flank. Prigozhin still proved that you can challenge Vladimir Putin and at least temporarily survive to tell the tale. Maybe if he stayed in Africa and he didn't fly back to Russia, he wouldn't be dead. Prigozhin still proved that even if people won't side with you when challenging Putin, that people will step aside when you challenge Putin. The mutiny proved that people were not going to come out onto the streets to save Vladimir Putin's regime. That when they were marching on Moscow, no one went out to stop Wagner. That's why they had to eventually rely on the Kadyrovites marching from the battlefield in Ukraine on Rostov. None of that is going to go back in the can. You can't, put the cap back on that. That's done. What this can do is, even though the damage is already done, is shore up their image, shore up their strength somewhat. That's what this can do. But that doesn't mean that there isn't necessarily negative side effects to this. There almost certainly are negative side effects to Putin assassinating Dmitry Utkin, for Putin assassinating Wagner. Now, let me say, before I talk about the negative side effects, let me just emphasize, I mean for the Russians. This guy was a butcher. Prigozhin was a butcher. He was a bastard. He was a terrible person. He behaved like a terrorist and a warlord of a medieval style and its type of brutality that you do not see with most developed militaries today. And that was his purpose. There was an illusion of difference between PMC Wagner and the proper Russian government. They did it. They made this difference through shell companies, by never having many officials like Utkin in the same room as other Russian government officials, through kind of, kind of keeping them at an arm's length. They wanted to keep these brutes at an arm's length so they can separate themselves from their brutality, so they could separate themselves from their war crimes. Even though after the coup, they proudly, hugged Wagner, not to support it, but to keep them to the chest and say, we funded it, we supported it. That changed once Wagner challenged them and they wanted to claim their accomplishments. But forever, they denied really much, if any, association with Wagner to begin with, definitely during their involvement in Africa. But Yevgeny Prigozhin oversaw the torture of POWs, the extrajudicial killing of POWs, his soldiers have been accused of castration and endless amounts of war crimes, the targeting of civilians, rape, murder, theft, a lot of theft and looting. They have been accused of every war crime in the book, and not even necessarily just against enemy soldiers, against their own soldiers as well. With soldiers who didn't want to engage in the sometimes near suicidal death charges in Bakhmut, they get the treatment of the sledgehammer, getting beaten to death by a sledgehammer, something that the Wagnerites were very proud of. They turned the sledgehammer into a symbol of Wagner's brutality, of its savagery, of its barbarity. And they were proud of it. They loved that image. They wanted to terrify people. That was their purpose. That was what they were in Ukraine to do. So what we're talking about here with Yevgeny Prigozhin's death isn't when we say about the downsides, I just want to emphasize, I'm talking about for the Russians. Yevgeny Prigozhin is a horrible, horrible man who managed the slaughter of tons of prisoners, of Ukrainians, the beatings of people with sledgehammers, and behaved like a warlord. Not only when it comes to how he managed soldiers and how brutal his divisions and his units were, but also how it comes to how he managed his finances and how in-depth he was with his criminal activity. He got into Russian politics as a common street thug, and he goes out of the world and out of Russian politics, not as a common street thug, but just one on a grander scale. That's always how he behaved, and that's always how his mentality has been. So when I talk about there being a negative effect of this, I'm only talking about for the Russians. Prigozhin being dead, I believe, is a net positive for the world, period. But tensions in Russia are strained. After the Wagner mutiny, and after so many failures, with the inability for the Russians to push forward in Kharkiv, for the failure of the winter counteroffensive, for how much damage they're taking in the Zaporozhye counteroffensive, even if the Ukrainians aren't taking large swaths of land, the amount of counter battery fire that's been destroyed, amount of counter batteries and Russian artillery that's been destroyed, the amount of Russian tanks that's been destroyed, the amount of casualties that's been doled out, the Russians are not doing fantastic in the Zaporozhye Oblast, in the Zaporozhye region, in that front line. And you don't need to take my word for it. You can just go to Russian Telegram and read their posts. Even if they stop the Ukrainians from taking Tokmak or any of these larger major locations before wintertime, that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians still haven't been hammering them and they're not in a bad state, because they are in a bad state. So the environment domestically in Russia is already very difficult for their military, especially as they're arresting many of their major critics, like Igor Girkin, who is a major critic of how the military establishment from the Russian MOD, people like Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, and Gerasimov are managing the war. And this is only going to intensify that negative relationship with the war blogger community. Let's read some of the posts that have been made and have been translated by War Translated, a great account on Twitter I think you should follow. Here's one. It is not clear yet whether the hero of Russia, Prigozhin, was on board. But if he was, then pack your belongings. We do not need this war. Then the next post he makes shortly after. Forgive me. When I calm down, I'll tell you everything. Now I can't give an adequate report on my thoughts. I'm sick. My head is foggy. Next one. I have never belonged to a circle of admirers of Strelkov, that's Igor Girkin. I never approved of his pessimism. He always unequivocally condemned Prigozhin's rebellion. But what has been done today is more terrible and more dangerous than this rebellion. Strelkov turned out to be a complete optimist. Catastrophe is inevitable. No one can avoid war. It is too late to pray for Russia. Our path towards a chance to survive will go right through purgatory. It's too late to whine and complain. By the way, the guys were partially right. 02-24-22, that's February 24th, first day of the Russian 2022 invasion, was just a walk compared to where we were brought with such actions. Now, there are more posts like this. Actually, let's read a few more before I give you guys my conclusion about all this. There are no official statements about the death of Prigozhin. Stop sowing panic, everybody. Rewriting the same headlines. No need to jump to conclusions. Competent authorities will investigate the causes of the crash. The next post just said, fuck. This is this post. 6,400 angry reactions. I think that did express the mentality over there. I do think this message expresses the mentality over there. Okay, so obviously there's a few takeaways you can take from the story. Number one, ding dong, the witch is dead. Ding dong ding, the witch is dead. So get that out of the way. I'll celebrate this the same way it's celebrated if the leader of ISIS got killed, with the type of terror that Wagner has been known for. Okay, so that's the first thing. I don't know how much I want to savor the moment of imagining like Prigozhin just like falling out of the sky, going Shoigu. I don't know how much I want to savor that moment, how much I want to like hypothesize the things that ran through his head, the things that him and Utkin bickered about like how much they blamed each other. If only you would have kept marching on Moscow, Prigozhin. No. If you would have trained Wagner guys better. I can do that all day. I'm sure many of you guys can do that. I'll leave that to the comedians. I'll leave that for you guys to imagine how that went down. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, impact on morale. I think this is going to have a very negative impact on morale. Definitely if you're anybody that was ever Wagner affiliated or still Wagner affiliated. Maybe if you really, really hate Wagner, it's not going to have an effect on you. But I do think that this is going to have an effect of making many people think, well, if I criticize the war too heavily, maybe this will be my outcome. Just like the outcome for Igor Girkin was jail time. And while on the surface, you think that might be solving the issue of critique, but all that means is, well, there's no creaky wheel. And it's the creaky, squeaking wheel that gets the oil. So this could end up worsening the condition on the ground while allowing no pressure valve for the soldiers who are bleeding and dying and want a place to complain and need a location where they can fundraise from volunteers in order to help their units, where they want to be honest about the situation. So I don't think this is going to be great for morale. I don't think that is going to be great for morale at all. In fact, I think many Russian soldiers are going to view this as a victory for the Ukrainians. That's somebody that the Ukrainians hated.
Lemmy has donated $5. Breaking news. The ghost of Kyiv was spotted returning from Russian airspace.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I think that many people are going to view this as a victory for Kiev. I mean, if Budinev, if the head of the GRU or Zelensky announced that they had killed Prigozhin and they had done this, it would be a gigantic outrage in Russia. Ukrainians would view it as a gigantic victory, not only just Prigozhin, but Utkin and many of his top staff, as well as many as 10 of their top staffers. Oh my God, it would be a gigantic victory. The Ukrainians would be celebrating. It would be gigantic. And heck, now, according where I'm streaming right now, at the time I'm streaming right now, it's Ukrainian Flag Day. they would have even more reason to celebrate. So I think that a lot of people see this as undermining the Russian war effort and helping the Ukrainians in order to shore up the establishment's support, the support of people like Shoigu and Gerasimov. And that goes to my next point. This couldn't have happened without the pushing forward by people like Shoigu and Gerasimov, as they've tried to box in Prigozhin for months. Even before the mutiny, they tried to box him in, whether it be with the new MOD contracts, whether it be with the back and forth rhetoric, mostly from Prigozhin, mind you, just constantly slamming them for the mismanaging of the war, whether it be the slam of his critiques of them for not locating Wagner enough resources, whether it be them trying to get the equipment back from Wagner, the heavy equipment like tanks and armored vehicles, and trying to give that instead to the National Guard, which has a stronger pro-Putin ally at the head of it. That infighting was going back and forth. So I think that a lot of people are going to connect this to the military establishment, and it shows that Shoigu and Gerasimov, even though their competency is very much in question, how they've managed the war has not exactly been top tier. There are many valid critiques of how they have managed the Russian war effort, no matter how many problems the Russians have ran into. Because Shoigu and Gerasimov are longtime allies of Putin, Shoigu especially is a longtime ally of Putin, and that the opposition, Prigozhin, in a way challenged Putin directly. It seems like they are more empowered, or they are in a stronger position than ever, even though the critiques of the Russian Ministry of Defense still want them removed more than ever. So I don't think Gerasimov or Shoigu is going anywhere anytime soon. Dylan, it's Budanov. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. You must be. I 1 second. You're Evil City. You've been subbed to my channel for quite a while now. You must be new here. I'm an American. I mispronounce everything. I maybe you're unfamiliar, but I was born in the United States. So I hope you treat my my disability with a little bit of respect and don't be so ableist in the future. Joking, of course. I really don't know what else to say about Prigozhin's death. I guess I view this kind of in the same way as, like, you know, when Heydrich Himmler, not Heydrich Himmler, but when Heydrich was killed in like 1942, or when Rudolf Hess's plane. Actually, Rudolf Hess makes more sense because he tried to go to the UK in a plane. But this is, you know, probably the closest many of Wagner's victims, whether it be the people beaten to death with sledgehammers, people extrajudicially killed, the people raped, or even, like, in many instances, the Russian civilians that are victims of Wagner, which are talked about a lot less. And the reason they're talked about less is not only because it's not an angle that is covered widely in the media and there's a lot of reporters there to cover, but also is because the majority of the damage they're doing is to Ukrainians. But a lot of these murderers that they were taken out of prison, throwing into Ukraine, allowing to giving them a get out of jail free card, people who have been convicted of murder, throwing them in Ukraine to fight for a few months, then they go back to their home villages and they murder people. Wow, you gave the murderers military training and they used it to murder people. What a big surprise. Wagner's reign of terror is probably not going to be the same again. Now, that's not to say that Wagner is necessarily going to be abolished, or that they're not going to have other PMC that engage in similar behavior. I have been shelled by PMCs in Ukraine before. I've seen them target aid workers, other PMCs like PMC Convoy, PMC Levada, the PMC owned by the head of the Crimean Occupation Authority. So it's not like this is going to change forever and there's going to be no brutality. There are other butchers that they can call upon, but Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group, Dmitry Utkin's Wagner Group, the people who have been there since the start, that is dead. It probably was dead ever since he backed off of the coup and the organization was, you know, stunted and sent off to Belarus. I mean, we didn't know it at the time, but it seems like Yevgeny Prigozhin has been a dead man walking probably for months, and Putin was waiting for a good opportunity to strike. We don't know for sure that it was done by Putin, but I mean, I also don't want to play coy here and pretend we don't know what we all speculate to be the likely reason why Yevgeny is dead. And it isn't just so happens to be that all of the top Wagner officials, including Dmitry Utkin and Yevgeny Prigozhin, happened to be in a plane that just so happened to spontaneously combust midair and then crash into the ground. I don't think that is likely. Anyway, one of the main characters of the war is dead. One of the main brutes of the war is dead. This is the closest Wagner's victims will probably get to justice, since he's not going to be in front of any international criminal court or organization that'll hold him to account to his crimes. That's sad, but it's also more than I ever expected to happen. I thought most likely Yevgeny Prigozhin would get away with his crimes and be able to survive the war, living in some condo into his late years, dying of old age. But no, God had other plans for him. Plans that seemed a lot more just than what I originally thought they had laid out for him. And you gotta think, after so many people brutalized, after so many people done wrong, after so many terrorist acts and so much torture and mistreatment, how much the tool of anticipation of pain must have been used. You know, during torture sessions, it's not just continuously beating them and beating them and beating them until they break. It's you punch them and then you wait. That anticipation of pain is one of the worst parts of torture. It's so psychologically damaging as they're wincing for strikes that have yet to come. And it makes me think about what he must have thought of, and I said this earlier, what he must have been thinking about as that plane was spiraling to the ground.